Hello and welcome to this video. The subject, as you can see on screen, is high dynamic range, better known as HDR. All cameras, including those we pay quite a bit of money for, cannot capture the range of contrast that we can see with our own eyes. This gap between us and our technology is why we're often out with the camera and inspired to raise the camera to our eye, but then maybe we're a little disappointed when we see the results as thumbnails on our computer. It's all to do with that gap, the gap between what we see and what we're able to capture. They are not the same. HDR is one of the ways that we can better cope with the ratio of light to dark in our images. Instead of taking just one photo, HDR uses maybe three, taken all with different exposures. Now, using ACR, we can merge those three images together, so then we have a much greater range of contrast within the image. It's a very similar technique at the start as we experience with panoramic images. With these three images, which I shot from a tripod, I'd like to take a look at the metadata just before we start. So with the first one highlighted, I've opened the metadata panel so we can see that all three of these were shot with 100 ISO. This one has 5.6 at a quarter of a second, and that little dash there indicates that this is the exposure the camera felt was right. This one was shot with 2 stops less exposure, so the same f-stop, but the shutter was varied. And this one has 2 stops more exposure. So what we've got here is a complete range. We've got the shadows, which are taken care of in the right hand one. We've got the midtones perhaps with the one on the left, and we've got the highlights and the sky with the one in the middle. So let's make a HDR. It's a pretty simple process up to the point where we create the image that we then need to manipulate in Camera Raw. So I'm going to select all three, hit the Enter key to open up Camera Raw. There's the three images on the left hand side. Control A will select all. I'm going to go over to the right hand side. I'm going to go to my lens corrections and just tick to remove chromatic aberration and also enable profile corrections, because then I need to go to the top right of the thumbnails and merge to HDR. Once the HDR merge preview window appears, there's not a lot we really need to do here. The align images, well, these three images were shot from a tripod, so they shouldn't be a problem. But if we're shooting three images on a cliff top and it's a bit windy, there's always a possibility there can be just a little bit of movement, even if we've got a tripod sometimes. So I'm going to leave that box ticked, but if we handheld these shots, it would be quite important that the images were aligned. The next option says apply auto tone and color adjustments. To be honest, I'm not bothered whether we do this or not, because the process here takes three raw images and it merges them into one raw image. So if that image appears on screen later with some adjustments, I can change them. If it's got no adjustments, I can put them in. So unless you need this ticked as a guide, then it's really irrelevant. Down below we have de-ghost. At the moment it's off. If there is a little movement, and there could be movement in the waves here, I'm going to select this high. I assume that if I do that, you can see it's doing something as I've selected it. It may take slightly longer to merge the images. But if there is any ghosting in the image because I'm stitching three images, well, I'd like Photoshop to take as much care as it can in eliminating that ghosting. So I'm going to go ahead now and merge the file together, and the first thing is we're going to be asked for a file name, but it does suggest one and I'm quite happy to accept that. I'm going to click Save, and on the left hand side we should see another thumbnail appear, and there you can see the HDR has been prepared. Now I brought you back into Photoshop's bridge because our HDR image that we've just merged should have the dynamic range of all these three. So now I'm going to open this up into Camera Raw because we still have to do our editing. Now if you look over on the right hand side, you can see that there's quite a number of those sliders that have been adjusted. So I'm going to leave them for the moment, but the first thing about this image is I am not very keen on having blue water. The color balance here is obviously very wrong. So I'm going to go to my white balance tool, click into the water, if I can pick it up correctly, and that looks better already. I think we need more exposure in the water, but certainly the color is more as it should be. So looking at the image, I'm going to make a few changes. You'll notice the automatic settings didn't put any clarity or dehaze in here. Clarity is like a mid-tone contrast, and it almost always helps. It's just a question of how much we put in. The shadows have been put in quite strong. Maybe I'll tweak things up just a little bit. I'm going to give a healthy slug of color too, so we're beginning to get somewhere. You can see with the HDR we've got tone in the water, which we can lighten a little bit. We've still got tone here, but we've got a fairly strong sky, and we've hardly done any manipulation here yet. So what I'm going to do next is to put a graduated filter into the sky. So let's select it. I'm going to start about midway, holding the shift key, dragging it down. Oh, there's some heavy settings in this look, so I'm going to right click and reset them, touch the V key, so I can just drop down the exposure on that sky, boost the color a little bit, maybe a bit more clarity, maybe even a touch of dehaze. Now I've got a lovely rich sky there. Getting a little bit of ghosting maybe around here, but maybe I can do something about that in Photoshop. And I still like to lighten this as well, and maybe another gradient right at the top, just to hold the top of the sky in. Let me bring the V back so we can straighten this up, because that was a little bit wonky. I could even choose, if I wanted to put a bit of colour in that. Personal choice, I would suggest. Need to get this right. That looks a bit strong, so we'll just bring it down a bit. But just a hint of blue. It just gives that nice mix between cool colours up here and warm ones down here. I think what I'll also do is try to lighten the water a little bit. So I'm going to do that with an adjustment brush. I'll just sweep along the area and take a look at the settings. There's a few changed there, so back to the pin, right click and reset. What do I want to do? Well, I want to raise the highlights a little bit, and maybe I'll need a bit more exposure, and I just need to wipe my brush along there just to lift that nicely. That's not too bad. I'm going to move the temperature a little bit to the right because there's still a bit of blue there. As long as I don't go too far, that looks okay. Maybe a little more exposure to brighten it a bit more. And I think I'm ready to stop at that point. I think we have our HDR. We could all choose to do something different, and if we could save this and come back in the morning, perhaps when we look at it in the cold light of a new day, we would think of other things to do. But at the moment, I'm going to open this up into Photoshop. Now I want to do a little bit of burning of the highlights around those leaves there. If I select the tool from the toolbox, the burn tool, you'll notice I've got a no entry sign. I'm going to select highlights and an exposure. I'm going to make the exposure about 10% in a moment or two, but I cannot darken the image while it's a smart object. So what I could do here is just make a quick direct copy of it, Control J, and then I could rasterize this and I could do the work here. If it doesn't go according to plan, I can dump this in the bin and I've still got a smart object to work on. Best of all worlds. And now of course I've got a little cross there that tells me in fact that I've got my cap locks on, and that's why we're not seeing the little ring which is the brush, which I've just increased in size. I'm going to zoom into the area I want to work. It's more or less across there. So I'm going to bring my brush down now I've got that enlarged. The exposure I'm going to set at 10%, and I just want to do a little bit of work around the edge here. Hope you can see those highlights just going down a little bit. It does make the difference, little subtle changes like this, and from time to time you may find it's a good idea to zoom out and just have a quick look and zoom back in. Sometimes we can be too close to the wood to see the trees. A little bit of darkening along there and along the edge, and Control 0. Yes, I think I'm reasonably happy with that. I think I've missed one obvious change. I think the horizon needs a bit of a straighten. Could have done that in Camera Raw, but now we're here. I'll pick up my crop, I'll pick up my straighten tool, and I'll tell Photoshop that that should be level. It wasn't far off, but a little bit. I could possibly bring that bottom up a little bit to improve the composition. The only one part of this image I'm not too keen on is the horrible sign that was in the way of the tree there. There we have my final HDR image. I've taken that sign away, but I didn't demonstrate it on video because it's exactly the same techniques that we've discussed a number of times with content aware fill. When you're out shooting landscapes and seascapes, I think they are the most tricky when it comes to exposure, because when you look at the scene, the range of exposure across the entire scene varies wildly from the top left corner to maybe the bottom right corner. So it's not a bad idea sometimes to bracket exposures just to make sure we get the perfect one. But of course, if we do bracket exposures, then we always have the opportunity as well to try a HDR. Now I think the vast majority of the higher end image editing that we do is HDR in one form or another. We don't always put three images together, but when we're trying to make the most of the shadows and the midtones and the highlights to get that contrast, the sparkle, the clarity, the wow value, we're doing basically the same. We're trying to stretch the dynamic range of what our camera has captured.